Welcome to the Wealth Wisdom, where knowledge becomes power and power builds your future.
Most people think revolution starts with noise, with headlines, hype, and prediction charts that scream for attention. But the truth is far more unsettling. The biggest technological revolutions begin quietly, almost invisibly, slipping into the world without a sound, until suddenly they are everywhere. And by the time the world wakes up, the early investors are already gone, holding the kind of life-changing gains everyone else spends the next decade chasing. That is the uncomfortable reality of microcap innovation. The most explosive companies in history look irrelevant, tiny, or even laughable in the beginning. Amazon looked like a bookstore. Nvidia looked like a graphics toy. Tesla looked like a hobby for engineers. And the companies that reinvent industries always follow the same paradoxical pattern. They appear insignificant right before they become inevitable. Today's video is about one company that might be following that pattern. A MicroCap AI robotics stock that almost nobody is paying attention to, yet is quietly building technology powerful enough to reshape how factories run, how warehouses move, and how physical work happens across the world. And while the world is consumed by the giants, Palantir, Nvidia, Tesla, Boston Dynamics, a tiny company is building something that fits into the next great shift, the fusion of AI intelligence and physical automation. But before we get into the specifics of this company, there's a bigger story here, a story about how robotics went from fantasy to prototype, to necessity, a story about why the future of work is not just digital, it is physical, and why AI alone is no longer enough. We are entering an era where intelligence must extend into the real world, where algorithms must control objects, where machines must take action instead of simply analyzing data. And the companies that solve this problem, the companies that merge AI with robotics, will define the next industrial revolution. The only question is, which ones will rise and which ones will be forgotten? To answer that, we need to travel back, not to the present, but to the origins of modern automation. Because every major transformation starts with a misunderstood beginning. In the early 1990s, automation was a rigid, mechanical world. Robots were pre-programmed arms that repeated static movements over and over again. They were powerful, but not intelligent. They couldn't adapt, couldn't learn, couldn't make decisions, and could only perform perfect motions in perfect conditions. To change their behavior, programmers had to rewrite entire scripts by hand. These machines transformed manufacturing, but they couldn't handle complexity. They couldn't handle diversity. They couldn't handle the unpredictable nature of real life. They were blind, and for nearly 20 years, that limitation defined what robotics could and couldn't do. Then, something unexpected happened. A series of breakthroughs in computing, vision, and machine learning shifted the industry. Robots gained the ability to see. They gained the ability to process images, recognize patterns, map environments, avoid obstacles, track movement, and respond to new conditions. The static world became dynamic, but it still wasn't enough. Vision alone didn't create intelligence. Robots needed decision-making, systems that could interpret the world and choose actions in real time. That meant AI, and that's where things started to accelerate. When deep learning exploded in the mid-2010s, robotics quietly entered a new era. Suddenly, machines could adapt. They could learn from data. They could update their models. They could improve with experience. But these new intelligent robots had a problem. They were expensive, bulky, and complex. Only huge corporations could afford them. Small businesses couldn't touch them. This brings us to the next turning point, the rise of microscale robotics companies. Not the giants, not the ones with billion-dollar R&D budgets, the tiny startups, the small engineering groups, the scrappy innovators who didn't have the luxury of endless resources, so they had to be smarter. They focused on affordability, efficiency, modularity, real-world use cases. And because they were small, they could move faster than the giants. They could test ideas quickly. They could adopt AI updates instantly. They could operate in industries the big robotics firms treated as too small or too inconvenient to pursue. This was the origin stage. Now we move into the rise. By the early 2020s, warehouses around the world were drowning in demand. Labor shortages increased. Supply chains cracked. Costs exploded. Efficiency dropped. Companies needed automation desperately, but traditional solutions were too expensive and too rigid. They needed robots that could think, robots that could navigate, robots that could adapt. This demand created an explosion of opportunity for microcap robotics startups. They weren't trying to replace humans entirely. They were augmenting them. They were solving the most painful bottlenecks that were killing modern logistics. Picking, sorting, moving, lifting, tracking, scanning, navigating, all tasks perfect for robotic AI. And while investors obsessed over software AI, a small network of robotics companies began integrating advanced neural networks into physical systems. They were building robots that didn't just move. They chose how to move. Robots that could interpret space. Robots that could cooperate with humans. Robots that could work across diverse environments. This is where our microcap story begins. A tiny company, barely covered by analysts, barely noticed by institutional investors, began developing autonomous robots designed for industrial use cases. These weren't humanoid robots. They weren't sci-fi creatures. They were functional, intelligent machines built for one purpose: to solve the most painful operational problems companies face today. They learned from real-world data. They improved with experience. They updated through cloud systems. Their intelligence wasn't fixed. It evolved. And just like Palantir's early government work, the most interesting partnerships were happening quietly, hidden behind NDA letters, pilot programs, and small-scale trials. The company wasn't big. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't noisy. But it was doing something very few microcaps could accomplish, integrating AI into robotics in a way that created compounding advantage. And then came the breaking point. Something shifted around 2024 to 2025. Labor shortages worsened globally. The cost of physical work skyrocketed. Warehouses, factories, and distribution centers struggled to operate at scale. And for the first time ever, industries that resisted automation began adopting it out of sheer necessity. This is the moment when robotics demand exploded. Government incentives for automation increased. Corporations rewrote their logistics plans. Retailers redesigned their warehouses. Even small businesses began looking for affordable robotics solutions. Suddenly, MicroCap robotics companies were no longer fringe. They were essential, and our featured company found itself in a very unusual position. It had the right technology at the right time, in a market that was no longer optional. It wasn't competing with giants. It was filling gaps that giants couldn't fill fast enough. But this rise attracted attention, and not all of it was good. Cheap competitors flooded the market. Legacy players tried to retrofit old systems with new AI. Venture-backed firms burned cash trying to build hardware without understanding the realities of robotics. The hype wave created chaos, and this chaos led to the next stage, fallout. Here's where companies began separating into survivors and failures. The failures all suffered from the same weaknesses: expensive hardware, slow deployment, weak AI integration, high maintenance costs, and poor real-world performance. They collapsed under their own complexity. The survivors thrived for the same reasons Palantir thrived: difficult to replicate intellectual property, deep integration with customer operations, long-term contracts, high switching costs, compounding data advantage, network effect through deployments. And among these survivors, the quiet MicroCap company continued expanding, slowly, methodically, and far below the mainstream radar. Now the story shifts to the pattern, the repeating cycle we've seen before in tech history. Think about it. Nvidia was ignored before the GPU revolution. Shopify was ignored before the e-commerce revolution. Tesla was ignored before the EV revolution. Palantir was ignored before the AI defense revolution. The repeating pattern is simple. The most transformative companies look irrelevant until the world needs them. And right now, the world needs robotics powered by AI more than ever. Let's look at the data. According to global projections, the demand for intelligent robotics is expected to grow from $40 billion to over $100 billion within a decade. Nearly 70% of warehouses worldwide are still unautomated. Over 80% of factories still rely on manual processes. More than 2.1 million unfilled industrial jobs exist globally. This isn't optional anymore. It's survival. And here's the most important part. AI without robotics is incomplete. Robotics without AI is obsolete. The future belongs to the integration of both. MicroCap robotics companies that master this integration stand to benefit massively. But then comes the part investors usually ignore: the failed fixes. Governments have tried to solve labor shortages with temporary foreign labor programs. It didn't work. Corporations tried to solve inefficiency by adding more managers. That didn't work. Economists tried to solve productivity stagnation through monetary stimulus. That did nothing. Every traditional solution failed because the problem is structural. Complex systems require intelligent automation. Nothing else can replace it. And so, inevitably, the world returns to robotics not as an option, but as the only viable path forward. And in this environment, MicroCap robotics companies with solid R&D suddenly become priceless. Now we arrive at the present moment. The moment of inflection, where the quiet becomes loud, where the obscure becomes obvious, and where early investors have a brief window to position themselves before mainstream awareness triggers valuation expansion. This is the moment of greatest asymmetry, microscopic market cap, massive addressable market. But as always, timing matters, understanding matters, and perspective matters. So what do we take away from all of this? First takeaway: the biggest opportunities in robotics will not come from the giants. They will come from the small, nimble innovators solving real-world industrial pain points with AI. Microcaps today are the mid-caps of tomorrow and the giants of the next decade. Second takeaway: AI is shifting from the digital world into the physical world. The companies that integrate both successfully will dominate industries for decades. The convergence of intelligence and embodiment is the true revolution, and it is already happening faster than most investors realize. Third takeaway: every major technological shift follows the same pattern: ignored at first, then ridiculed, then suddenly obvious. The investors who win are the ones who recognize the pattern early, not the ones who wait for confirmation. But here's the warning: microcap investing requires caution. It requires research. It requires emotional discipline. These companies are volatile. They move fast. Their futures are not guaranteed. And even promising players face risks, capital constraints, competition, supply chain issues, regulatory pressures. This video is not financial advice. It is awareness. It is perspective. It is a story of technological evolution and the small companies riding its wave. The open-ended thought to leave you with is this: what if the next great robotics company, the next NVIDIA of physical AI, is already here, invisible to the masses? What if the next giant starts with a market cap under $200 million? What if the biggest opportunity of this decade is not in the companies everyone is watching, but the companies nobody sees yet? Because history doesn't reward the crowd. It rewards the prepared. It rewards the curious. It rewards those who learn to see the future before the headlines arrive. If you want more deep dive breakdowns into emerging AI companies, robotics innovators, and hidden microcap opportunities, hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. The next decade will be defined by automation, and together, we're going to stay ahead of it.